Hello there and welcome to TrendMiner Tutorial Thursdays. Today we're going to work on setting up our own tracking system and we're going to do that in 3 separate steps. So first of all, we're going to zoom in and use or set up our context hub to use the right types and elements that we want to use for our use case. Second off, we're going to set up a small asset framework so that we can leverage the hierarchy in our plant to do the correct tracking. And then third of all, of course, we're going to set up the right criteria and conditions in Trend Hub to make sure we capture those conditions. All right. Before we dive into the Context Hub and setting up our types, I just want to go quickly over the data that we're going to be working with today. So as you can see, I'm just working with a couple of simple tags. I'm working with a pressure and a temperature reading just to keep it simple. And as you can see, there is one major shutdown in this data set. So if I zoom into this part right there, you'll notice that my darker green temperature is mostly around 450 degrees, but there is a clear shutdown over there. So if I would zoom in, you would see that there's a shutdown happening, after which in a couple of steps this section is being ramped up again. So that is already one clue, one type of loss or one type of event that I would like to track going forward. Otherwise, you'll notice that my pink tag, my desalter pressure, is mostly steady. Here and there's a couple of oscillations and a couple of set point changes. In there, probably I want to focus first on those oscillations. So just a little bit getting familiar with the data set. If I would zoom into a period without a temperature shutdown, you'll notice that I go out of this auto scale and I can see more clearly what is happening with that temperature. So also there, mostly steady, couple of temperature changes or set point changes, and a couple of oscillations or unstable periods. So those are kind of the periods that I would like to zoom into today. All right. When you start working on a use case like this and I want to set up my tracking, there's a couple of ways I can go. Obviously, I can dive right in and just select a period of choice, which then I would annotate. Right. Advantage, it's very easy. Disadvantage is that it might not be super accurate if I want to use the same conditions over and over. There might be a little bit of a difference between the different periods. So I'm not going to do it manual right now. I'm going to use actually the search capabilities to do it a little bit more structured today. All right, but that's just looking at the data set. Let's take a step back and come back to our 3 steps, right? And those 3 steps will be working for you every time you want to tackle a use case like this. First of all, do I have the proper configuration set up? Do I have the correct types that I'm going to use today? Second topic is actually the asset framework. So do I have the right components in play? Have I thought about, is this, let's say, a unit general issue, or is this something I want to specifically tie to a tag? And we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail later on. And then the final step is actually defining the conditions so I can link them back to the right type and the right component in my asset tree and kind of bringing it all together. Those are the 3 steps that will work for you every time you do this type of use case that we're also going to follow today. Now, let's get started and actually do this. So we're going to jump into Context Hub. And we're going to look at the available types that I have. Now, here I have to make one additional disclaimer. It is that the configuration that is available up in the right-hand corner, that is only available to application administrators. So if you want to do this step specifically, either you can use the existing types, or you can get in touch with one of your administrators, if you're not one yourself, to set up the correct types. That's a one-off action. This is something that will only need to happen once, and from there on, the type and the configuration is going to be available. But if you just get started, it's possible that you will have to reach out to one of your colleagues. If you're not sure about who that colleague is, feel free to reach out to TrendMiner, and we might help you along the way. All right, so let's dive into configuration, and you'll see that there's a number of options available there. Now, to talk about context items, that would take us a long way today if I want to cover all of the different elements that there are to it and all of the different possibilities I have here, because they're endless. So what I'm going to zoom into today or focus on today is only the really necessary. So I'm going to set up one type, and I'm going to assign 2 context fields to it and 1 workflow. Okay. To get started, I will go into context fields and I will create the context fields that I need for my use case today. So for example, I could set up a context field that talks about desalter instability, or let's do it a step back. We can talk about the reason or the category of loss. Right, let's just call it category, and the placeholder might be, for example, shutdown. This is going to be a text field, so it's available for editing for everyone. And let's give this a technical identifier. This is not too important for you today, but this is the code that you would use if you want to do some programming, if you want to interface with TrendMiner via a programming language. So I'll just call this category, all in uppercase letters as such. And I'm going to add a second type of field, and I will call this loss, and I will indeed use the same denominator as I had before, loss in tons, and I'm going to give this placeholder, for example, 5 tons per hour. And this will be a number field, so this is going to be a numeric value, all right? And hit save again. So now if I look into my technical identifiers, you'll notice that my category and my loss types have been added, or my loss fields have been added, which now I can use and I can attach to any of the next context item types that I'm about to create. Okay, I'm also going to add a workflow. That's the second element that I have to attach to a context item type. Now, in this case, I'm not actually going to create a new one because I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm going to reuse the start and end workflow. So think about a workflow as something that has a certain start point, a number of intermediate points in between, for example, cooling phase, heating phase, loading, unloading, and an end state, or whatever you want to call it. This could be start stop for a motor, or this could be on off for a pump. So you can choose what type of states you want to add to the context item type, but it's basically just to show you what the sequence is that a context item might go through. So the different phases that are linked to that event. Simple one is start stop or start end, but you can make it as complex and add as many steps in between as you would like. The only thing that is important is that you add a start and an end position. Those are fixed, and then in between you can add the different phases. So in this case, I'm going to reuse start and end. Okay, I have my fields, I have my workflow. So now I'm ready to actually create my new context item type. I'm going to hit up here, I'm going to hit add item. I will call this loss training, or loss example, in this case loss training. The human readable name will be loss event. And I will attach here that workflow to it that I was just talking about before. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to select start and end states. All right, the next couple of configurations is just a little bit for visualization. So I can choose a color and an icon that corresponds to this type. So for example, I will select the wheelbarrow and I'm going to make this of the red color. All right. And finally, I'm going to attach the context fields that I've just created, and you can see it automatically pops up with the most recent items, the most recent ones that have been created. So I'll select loss in tons, and I will select also the category. Those are the two that I have created before. And you notice that there's these switch bars. These are the ones I can pick one that will be active. That will be the label that is associated with this context item type whenever I create a Gantt chart. We'll get to that in a moment. All right. And the final options, I can allow approvals or turn on the history, but I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to keep it simple and hit save. And now this context item type is available. So in my list, you notice that this loss training event is now available as a context item type that can be created and that can be used in my setup. Okay, so quite simple, these steps. If I want to go through these same steps, but I'm not an administrator, just keep in mind what are the things that your administrator will need. That is the type itself. So what do you want to call the type? What workflow do you want to attach to this type? And then finally, what are some of the fields you want to have available on that context item? So a couple of fields are by default available, like a description, you can add keywords. But if you want to add any specific ones on top of that, you would have to let your administrator know so he can create them. All right. Now, that was step one. Step 2 is I want to work with an asset framework so that I can actually assign the different losses that I'm about to use or about to create, that I can assign them to my place in the asset hierarchy. Now, again, this is an administrator action that you might need some help for to execute, but if you have an external asset framework like by asset framework and it's already synced with TrendMiner, that would already be available for you to use. So in case you haven't by asset framework, you probably want to talk to your administrator to link that up to TrendMiner. That's going to make your life a lot easier. But if you don't, it's actually possible very simply to create one in TrendMiner. So if I go back into configuration and to asset structure, you'll notice that I can upload my own structure, and there is actually a example available for me to look at. So I will open that item up, and give me 1 second while this pops up on my second screen. There we go. So you see here a very simple example of an asset framework that is already configured in this example. Okay, so when I hit the current configuration, it's going to make an export of my current configuration. If not, if you want to start from scratch, you are able to download an example file that you can then edit to your liking. But it's a very simple structure, so it will contain, let's say, the hierarchy itself, which is the path. I can add my own names to it, a description to the elements or the attributes in my tree, and finally I can give it a type. So it's either going to be an attribute, which is the lowest level in the tree, or it's going to be an asset. I can link templates to it, and I can link it to a specific tag. Okay. So in this example, what I want to do is I'm going to add a couple of lines. So I'm going to make this an additional element in my tree, and I'm going to call this the desalter pressure, and I'm also working with a temperature. Oh. Name is going to be the same, so I'm going to call this attribute the desalter pressure and the temperature. Description I'm going to leave blank. These are attributes. OEE itself is an asset. And I have to be careful, not attributes, but attribute. And finally, I need to provide it with the tag name that I was using. So let me go out and have a quick look at what those tag names were. So I'm going to go into my tag menu, my recent tags. I had cleared them out just before I went over, so that's why they were not available. These were the tags I was looking at before. So it is going to be TM-OEE desalter pressure, TM-OEE desalter pressure.pnt, and it's going to be TM-OEE temperature. As you can see, these actions are quite simple, but of course, if I want to do this with a long tag list, it's probably not the best approach to do this manually. It's actually available, or we have some scripts available to help you there to make this easier based on your tag naming structure. If not, you can always reach out to us for some additional help there. Okay, so I've got this file ready. I'm going to load it up by navigating to the right screen, select the file and hit import, and this will take a couple of seconds. As you can see, it's processing. Alright, so it looks like I made a small mistake there. Let's rewind. I forgot to give this OEE element a name, that's why it failed. So I just went ahead and added a name, simply OEE, and I'm going to continue from there. So again, I'm going to browse for this file. I'm going to load it into TrendMiner by importing, and you'll see a green check mark telling me that this was successful. So from now on, these context or these asset elements will be available to me for my next step. So if I go into Trend Hub, my OEE element is available. All right, so this was a very simple example, and you notice TrendMiner already recognizes that I have added both tags as part of my asset tree. They are already on the trend. I had added them before. So already here, as you can see, it's very simple. that these elements can be added. There's probably a couple of best practices we should discuss at this point in time. So if you're working on or in a larger company, you probably want to reach out to your internal champions to make sure that if you want to add something to the structure, that it adheres to the best practices that have been defined within your company. For example, you may decide to add a root level that defines which plant or which location the attribute or the asset belongs to. For example, it could be EU or US as a region first, then it could be the location of, or even the country of the site, could be France, and then finally, for example, Le Havre, and then the refinery. So depending on your best practices within your company, you may want to reach out internally to set this asset structure correctly. What we're not going to dive into today is all these best practices as well as the permissions you can set up on the asset structure. That will be part of a next tutorial Thursday. But basically what you have to remember is that it's possible to set rights or permissions on different elements in your tree. So if you want to, for example, only have certain people see certain elements in your tree, you can do that by setting the right permissions. But for today, we're not going to cover that element. Okay. So we just finished step 2, which is setting up the asset framework. So remember, step 1, we set up our types that we're going to use for Context Hub. Step 2 was we set up the asset structure. Now step 3 is actually using TrendMiner's capabilities, search capabilities, for example, to make our lives easier and not have to add all the events manually. So we're looking here at these 2 tags. We have a desalter pressure and we have a temperature. And the first thing I already want to do is recognize this event right there, where my temperature of my furnace was below a certain threshold. So very simply, I could go in and have TrendMiner look at this temperature. And I know from experience, or I know from my colleagues, that anytime this temperature is below 250 degrees, the furnace is basically turned off and it has to be restarted. So I'm going to add 250 as a condition there. And just to avoid any blips, any too sensitive events from happening, let's say I just have a little outlier in my data, I will select at least for 15 minutes. I know if there's an uninterrupted period of 15 minutes, it's probably true, so I will define that period as such. When I hit search, you notice that in this data set right here, there is only one of those events that happened. So I'm going to very simply grab this event. I could go in and check it out to make sure that it's correct, but you can already see it is the event that I had selected before. By clicking a couple of times to the left and to the right, I can zoom out a little bit from this event, and you see indeed that this was where the temperature dropped significantly, and probably the furnace was turned off. Now, if I want to simply annotate this event, I would click the 3 little dots in my search panel, and I will annotate these results. This is a very simple way to create annotations on top of this, on these search results. And hit annotate. Automatically, it selected this tag as the component that I would add my, my event to. In this case, I'm actually going to overrule this. I don't want to tag. I want the asset that I had just created. So for example, I can go ahead and select OEE. If I want to go one level deeper, I could dive into OEE and select the individual attribute that this happened on. But the whole point of setting up our asset structure was to use the asset itself. So I'm going to select OEE right there. Hit select. Second step is I have to select the type. So this is where I would select the loss event that I've just created about 15 minutes ago. So I'm going to select that loss event. And now I can add some additional information. So this could be a furnace shutdown, for example. I add some keywords like furnace. Could be F101 if that is the name of your furnace. And I'm going to add a category. Now these categories, I selected free text. I could have selected a drop-down with predefined options. But let's say I want to keep this this open for a little bit of creativity. But I do want to adhere to certain categories. This could be, for example, an event with category code 110 furnace, right? So this is, again, this is where really you make it your own. This is where your own company standards and own company ideas come through. TrendMiner just allows you to follow those without any real limitation on what you can do there. And then the loss in tons, well, I can obviously calculate this using some of the other features. For example, by using the compare table or by using calculation on search result. In this case, I'm just going to add a blank value of 100. All right. You'll see that the events are locked. That's because I'm working off of a search. So these will be automatically filled in because of the search conditions that I added. Now, what happened when I hit annotate is TrendMiner is now going to look and show me which annotations have been made on the tag itself, on the attribute itself, but it also includes where applicable, it has been added to higher elements in the tree. So we know that these salted pressure and temperature, they're part of the OEE asset that we created. And you notice that on the screen, TrendMiner is going to show me this context item or this annotation on the first tag in my view of that particular component. So you notice when I click this little text balloon, it's going to show me exactly the context item or the loss event that I have just created a few moments ago. All right, so that is just a very simple way to dive or go through my data and see which events have happened over the course of time. All right, so that was one simple example. I've annotated where my temperature was dropping. The next thing I would like to do is look at these events right there, and I want to annotate where my desalter was not stable, because typically when my desalter is not stable, I'm going to have entrainment of water, and this water is going to cause all kinds of issues in my process. A couple of strategies I could follow here. I could do a search and look for events where maybe my pressure is exceeding certain limits. But in this case, that might not work perfectly because I noticed that there were a couple of set point changes, so I won't be able to, for example, identify this event right here because other times my set point was actually lower. So I really want to zoom in onto the oscillations or the instabilities that I have right there. One of the options I have here is actually create a new tag that's going to look at the range of movement of this particular measurement or this particular sensor. So I'm going to add an aggregation which grabs as an input the desalter pressure, and the operator is going to be the range. Range meaning the difference between minimum and maximum value. By the way, if I want more information of the different options, I can click this little information icon right there, and that's going to give me an overview of the tag builder. In the tag builder, if I go to aggregation, you'll notice what the options are that I have for aggregation. So if I don't know by heart what they mean, I always have the option to go into the help center and find out what they are. So in this case, I was right. I need the range operator. You can see it's the range between the maximum and minimum value within a given time interval. I'm going to select range, and these are, somewhat longer periods. You can see I've selected 1 day of data there. So aggregation per 10 minutes, I'm going to increase that a little bit and maybe make it 2 hours. If I have to change this later, I can always come back and edit that. So giving it a name, desalter pressure range. Now, at some companies, I know there are some best practices around naming your aggregation. So for example, I may be asked to add my location. So in this case, I am in Houston, Texas. So that might be the prefix that I use for my tags, the 3-letter code for my plant. In other companies, you're asked to use the description fields, for example, to add some descriptions added by Frederick Motte. And this formula or range of 2 hours of TM OEE desalter pressure. Now, this all depends on your own internal standards, but this is an option that you have so that other colleagues can see how this tag was created, and I will hit save on this. Now, that tag is now going to calculate and is going to be added to my view. So once that calculation is done, you'll notice now indeed the pink tag at the bottom of my screen represents the range of this tag, and you see very clearly that overall, the normal level of noise is around 0.1, 0.15. But for those periods of oscillation, it's really, really high, or it's a lot higher. So this is a helpful way to identify periods where my tag is oscillating or there's more movement in my tag than I would normally observe. Let me just quickly check if other events look like the same. So I'm going to zoom in here, and indeed again, I find similar periods where this is the case. So this might be a helpful way to create a tag that looks at the movement of my tag. Now, just to confirm, you notice that there are a couple of periods where this drops down quite low again. So it looks like some periods, my stability is just long enough for this not to, let's say, continue as a more continuous tag. So if I feel like maybe 2 hours was not sufficient, I want to increase this. It's very simple to go back into the tag builder. I'm going to load my saved tags and look at this tag I had edited, or that I had there. I will edit it and I'll select, for example, 4 hours, right? Now, TrendMiner is going to recalculate what I have on my screen, and now you notice this jumped to a better value, or to a better, let's say, continuous type of movement. So after editing this tag, I feel more comfortable setting up some search conditions that will find all these events where my desalter is unstable. So I can now create these search events and go out, create a new value-based search. In this case, instead of searching for the raw desalter pressure, I'm going to look for that range tag. I'm going to find periods where I'm higher, for example, than, let's make it a little bit less sensitive, 0.2 for at least 10 minutes. And let's see what we find when we do so. All right. So in total, I found seven results. If I narrow down a little bit my double slider, you'll notice these blue periods, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I already see by just looking at the trend. You notice that these are found quite easily. They're also of different length. That is important because sometimes it might just be 1 hour instability. Other days, it looks like you go through a full day and 16 hours of such instability. So that's probably quite severe. On the other hand, I do see that a couple of these events seem to be broken up. So if I zoom into this August 6th event and I go a little bit to the right, add some more data, it looks like this is a period where there was some instability. Let me make this 1 week of data. It seems that there was a set point change first. That was the first event. And then there was a somewhat longer period where the desalter pressure, but also the temperature, as you can see in the green tag, were oscillating. So depending if I want to divide this into different categories, I can make this one type of event, I can make the second type of event something else. What I'm going to do in this case is, instead of 10 minutes, I only want to see the really longer period. So I might want to make this like 8 hours, for example. And if I hit search, instead of the 7 events, I only have 4 now. And these are all longer than 8 hours, considerably so. See an event of 20 hours, 1 day, 1 day, 1 day. So those are more significant events that in this case I want to annotate. All right. Again, I will follow the same workflow. I will keep these results, annotate them, and I will follow the same workflow. So in this case, again, I'm going to get rid of the desalter pressure, which is the proposed attribute by TrendMiner, but I actually want to use the asset OEE again. I'm going to select that one right there. I'm going to make this again a loss event. In this case, instability in desalter observed based on range tag. So I can add some information to my colleagues on how I winded up with these events themselves. So based on range of pressure reading, keywords might be desalter. That might be D101, for example. And category will be 120 and desalter. So that again is very specific to my company or to the way I want to set up personally my loss tracking. In this case, the loss in tons, again, I would have to calculate first before I can add them to these events. I'm just going to hit save in this case. And again, you see these annotations popping up. The ones I had just created are now added to my view, you notice indeed that it spans around this period where I go through some kind of change, some oscillations, and it takes a while for that stability in the desalter to return. But at a given point, I get below the limit of 0.2. I stay below that limit for a significant amount of time, which was, I think we just set up to 10 minutes. Or no, we increased that value, sorry. But that's the way you see how those search conditions can affect the way you create your results. Okay, so zooming out, let me select this whole time range. You notice that a number of context items have been created. So even though I was just looking at one period to validate, actually a number of these results were created. And I created it for 2 events. I created it for desalter instability, and I created it for a furnace shutdown. Now, it's of course nice to do this manually, but I don't want to go back or come back every time and have to redo this. So if I go back into the search, and I'm just going to use the desalter as an example, all I have to do is hit save on the search. I will call this desalter instabilities. This is a search based on range tag of desalter pressure. Automatically, TrendMiner is going to show me the conditions I used, so it's higher than 0.2 for at least 8 hours. And if I want to, I can create some filters, but I don't need them today. I only need to say the search because I want to use the monitor that is attached to it, or that's going to be attached to it. So I hit save. And if I now go into my monitoring menu, you'll notice that there's a new entry for desalter instabilities. If I go in here, I can configure this. I don't want to send this to my inbox, my TrendMiner inbox. I also don't need an email message. All I want to do is annotate these events. I want to make sure that whenever this happens, this desalter instability, automatically context item is created, and that's going to be attached to my OEE asset. So I'm going to create a context item on the same asset OEE. I'm going to make this of the loss event type. And then here I can add some additional description, right? So for example, I could say linked to desalter instability search. I can add the same keywords. So I think I had D101 and I had desalter. I'm going to select those keywords. Category will be again 120 desalter. And the loss in tons I'm going to leave blank. In later versions, by the way, we'll be able to calculate these values. So for now, I'm just going to hit save. And then if I turn this monitor on, from now on, TrendMiner is going to be watching my data in real time. So as soon as the data streams into the historian, TrendMiner is going to check my conditions and whether or when they are true, I'm going to automatically create those context items. All right. So these are the kind of things I would do in TrendMiner. You notice it only we haven't been working on this for too long, and I already have a couple of conditions configured. As next steps, what I could do is I could create more conditions, create all of the or cover, for example. I'm really a fan of the Pareto distribution, so I could look at which conditions are responsible for, let's say, 80% of my losses, and make sure those conditions are tracked in TrendMiner. That's going to be a really good start, a really kickstart to your tracking initiative. And then, as other situations pop up, maybe I can add one category other that every month or every week I go through and make sure I add them to the right category. And if some things keep coming back, I add just a separate category for that type of event. So that's a way, like you get the low-hanging fruit, and then from there you have a good solid foundation that you can then extend and keep working on. So that's a very good way of working that I like personally a lot. Now, of course, we create now these annotations, we create these context items, we created the monitor. It's of course nice now to go in and see what that looks like, how these elements are distributed. So I'm going to go into Context Hub now, and I'm going to create a new view that will highlight these elements on the OEE assets. So I'm going to add a filter to my view, and I'm going to select the component as a filter, add a component, and I will select that OEE asset that I had in my tree. All right, and of course I was working on some historical data, so I won't have any events for the last 8 hours. So I'm just going to reduce this, for example, to 2018. And you notice I found 5 separate events, the 4 on the desalter, and then the one on the temperature that I had created. So very easy. You notice all I had to do was select my component, select the corresponding time frame, and I already see specifically what happened in this area of my process. Now, I selected one broad category as a simple example, OEE, but if you would have, or you drill down a little bit more, you have some pumps defined, you have some heat exchangers defined, you have, or even the areas in your process. So it could be, for example, reactor 101, which contains everything around that reactor, including all the assets I just mentioned. Or you have some trains, like you have the preheat train, you have the atmospheric distillation, vacuum distillation, and so on. So depending on your process, you can split this up in a couple of components, and then I can very easily add these components as filters, so I can see what is going on specifically on different elements in my process. All right. In this case, I'm just going to add or save this view. I'm going to call this loss training. Save this view, and I now have this available for any time I come back into TrendMiner. So even though I did this today, this could be interesting going forward. If I want to see if more events are happening over time, I want to review these monthly, I could come in here and I could actually set, instead of a specific time range, I could select, for example, the last 4 weeks and enable the live mode. That will make sure that every time I open this table, it's going to show me only those events that have happened over the last 4 weeks. So that's a way to really operationalize this workflow instead of just looking at historic data. Using the monitors and using the live mode, I will now be able to come back to this every time and see what's going on in my process without having to repeat again the manual steps that we went through in this video. But in this case, I only have the historic data, so this is where we're going to keep it. And I just want to show you one final step, which is a nice visualization in the Gantt chart, where you can see all of my events lined up in time. You can see by component and by type where they are located, and you see also the little label that was the loss in tonnage. Remember that little checkbox that we added? This is where you can see the losses added to your view very easily, so I can highlight them where the biggest events have happened, for example. I can even, some customers use smileys there, so they have an happy and unhappy smiley as the label. So that can be also another nice visual way of looking into my, or spreading it out, visualizing my data and seeing what is going on. So there we have it. I think these are, in a nutshell, some of the steps you can follow to set up your own tracking system. We only went through some simple examples today, but already we covered a lot of ground. We went through setting up your own context item types, which is important. That is the way basically you're going to segment and slice and dice your resulting data set. You can do it by type, for example, loss, or this could be, if you follow the real OEE workflow, this could be availability, performance, quality. You can tailor this to your own needs, but this is one way to break things down. The second way to break things down is by the asset structure. So we added a very simple asset structure there that had the OEE asset with just a couple of tags below that. But you can make this as big as you want, as granular as you want. We have some companies that have their full tag or their full historian tag by tag in such an asset framework. Or if you already have an asset structure in place, for example, the Pi asset framework setup, you can integrate that with TrendMiner, so you can leverage your previous investment to get to the same result. And then the third step was actually linking the analytics features in TrendHub, such as the different searches, and creating some additional tags to find those ranges where my temperature was unstable or my pressure was unstable. Use those capabilities to create those context items for historical use, but also for forward-looking use, so I can really operationalize those elements of my workflow. All right, that was it for today. I hope you liked this first session, this first Tutorial Thursday. There will be more Tutorial Thursdays to come. If you like this topic, give us a thumbs up. If you would like to see other topics, you have something on your mind you would like to get some more information on in this type of format, just let us know and we'll be happy to create that in the next session.